Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going deep on one of the all-time big thinkers in philosophy, Plato in his Republic. You guys sent in some really interesting articles about it, and well, it seems like you're interested in how Plato's ideas stand up to the scrutiny of modern philosophers.
Absolutely. Yeah. The Republic is one of those books that just never really goes away. It keeps on raising questions that are relevant today just as much as they were, back then in ancient Athens.
Oh, okay, yeah, let's get into it. So, the Republic really tries to answer this sort of deceptively simple question: is it always better to be just than unjust? But we're not talking about like just following the law here, are we?
Right. No, Plato's going way deeper than that.
Hmm.
He wants us to really think about the actual nature of justice, what it means for a person for their soul to be just, and whether that inner harmony really does lead to a good and fulfilling life, It's a question that gets right at the heart of ethics.
And that's where these two philosophical troublemakers, Glaucon and Imantis, come in. They give Socrates a real challenge, right? They don't want to just hear the same old stuff about justice. They want to be shown definitively that justice is valuable in itself, even if there aren't any external rewards or punishments.
Exactly. Yeah. They're basically prove to us that being just is good for your soul itself and not just for, staying out of trouble or getting people to like you. So Socrates has to come up with this really, really convincing argument.
So how does he go about this challenge? I mean, he could just define justice in a way that already means a happy life, but that seems kind of like cheating, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. And Socrates, he realizes that this is hard right from the start. He can't just assume, a definition of justice that already includes happiness. He has to show the connection, the link between the two. And that's why he takes this interesting, roundabout way of doing it. He proposes that we look at justice on a bigger scale, like a whole city, to see how it works inside, a person's soul.
It's like he's saying, if we can figure out what makes a city just and why that helps it to thrive,
Yeah,
then maybe we can see how those same ideas work for a person too.
precisely. Yeah, that's it. And this city soul analogy is actually one of the most debated parts of the Republic. Some scholars see it as a really strict one-to-one thing where every part of the city maps onto a part of the soul. But others say it's more of a tool, a way for Socrates to get his points across.
So even the analogy itself is open to different interpretations.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that makes the Republic so fascinating. It's not a closed system. It invites you to engage with the arguments, to question things, and to come up with your own understanding.
All right, let's dive into this analogy then. So Socrates starts by creating this ideal city, right? The famous Callipolis. But before we get lost in all the details of this utopia, I'm curious about why start with an ideal city at all?
That's a great question. Remember, Socrates is trying to explain justice. And he thinks that if we look at a city that's perfectly just, then we can see how justice works in its purest form. It's kind of like starting with a clear blueprint before you look at all the messy real world examples.
So Callipolis is like a model, a way to understand the principles of justice before applying them to, the messiness of real people's lives.
Precisely, yeah. It lets Socrates isolate certain ideas and really examine them in this controlled setting. And one of the key ideas he explores is that, a just city, just like a just soul, is one where each part is doing what it's supposed to be doing, its proper function.
And that brings us to that famous tripartite soul. So Socrates argues that the human soul is divided into three parts: reason, spirit, and appetite. And this idea has really stuck around, hasn't it? It's influenced everyone from people studying religion to people studying psychology.
Yeah, it's a really long-lasting idea, and it's not just about, sorting our thoughts and feelings into categories. Each part of the soul, for Socrates, has its own desires, its own beliefs, and even its own kind of pleasure,
So it's almost like we've got these three little agents inside us all fighting for control.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And Socrates makes some pretty good arguments for this tripartite view. For instance, he points to that inner conflict we all feel sometimes. You should eat healthy, but then your appetite is screaming for the extra piece of cake.
Oh, tell me about it. I think everyone can relate to that. But why does Socrates see this conflict inside us as proof that our soul is divided? Couldn't it just be that, our desires sometimes clash with our rational judgments?
That's a good point. And some philosophers have said exactly that, but Socrates thinks the strength and how these struggles keep coming back, it suggests something deeper is going on. It's like these different parts of us have their own goals, their own reasons for doing things. He uses this really vivid language to describe it, talking about the spirited part boiling with anger or the appetitive part being, enslaved by its desires.
It's interesting how he uses these almost personified descriptions, to make the parts of the soul come alive.
Yeah, yeah, it makes them more than just these, abstract ideas. And it lets him connect this psychological model to his bigger argument about justice. Because if the soul is really divided like this, then the question of justice becomes, how do we get these parts to work together peacefully?
Which is exactly what he's trying to do in Callipolis,
Yeah.
right? The city becomes this model for how the different parts of the soul can be, organized so we can have justice
Yeah.
and, in the end, happiness.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting because how Callipolis is structured, it's both really clever and, to us now, incredibly controversial. But we'll get into those details and what they mean in the next part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Before the break, we were talking about Plato's idea that a just city can help us understand justice, in a person's soul. And we left off with that really interesting and kind of unsettling idea of the tripartite soul, reason, spirit, and appetite, all kind of, vying for control.
Yeah, it's a powerful image, isn't it? And it makes you think about some really interesting questions about individual virtue. If justice really is this kind of harmony between those parts of the soul, how does that actually play out in the real world, in the choices we make? Like how do we go from this idea of psychological justice to actual ethical behavior?
That's a really important point. It's one thing to, have a well-ordered soul, but how does that inner harmony show up in the things we do, how we treat other people, how we live our lives?
So Socrates tackles this question in a bunch of different ways. One way he connects, inner justice to what we do is through the idea of knowledge, and specifically knowledge of the good. He says that people who truly understand the good, like they've really grasped what it is, they'll naturally act in a way that aligns with it.
Okay, but that brings up another question. We've talked about the forms before, and I know they're really important in Plato's philosophy, but for our listeners who might not be as familiar with this idea, could you maybe explain it a bit more? What does it mean to grasp the essence of the good?
Sure. So the forms for Plato, they're these eternal, unchanging, perfect blueprints for everything that exists in the physical world, the world we can see and touch. So there's a form of justice, a form of beauty, and most importantly, a form of the good. And these forms aren't just ideas that we have in our heads. They exist on their own in this realm beyond our senses.
So they're like the ultimate reality, the real essence of things.
Exactly. And Socrates says that real knowledge, it's not about just knowing specific examples of justice or beauty in the world. It's about understanding the form itself, the underlying principle that makes all beautiful things beautiful.
Okay, I think I see where this is going. So someone who has grasped the form of the good, they understand the real nature of goodness itself, right?
Exactly. And Socrates says that this understanding, it has a huge impact on how they act. They don't just do good things because it's, socially acceptable or because they're scared of being punished. Their whole being is oriented towards the good. It's what drives them at the deepest level.
But isn't that kind of a really high standard? I mean, most of us aren't going to spend our days, contemplating these eternal forms. Does that mean we're all just doomed to live unjust lives?
No, not at all. Socrates knows that not everyone can reach this kind of philosophical insight, but he also thinks that even those who haven't, grasped the forms can still live just lives, through the right kind of education and by forming good habits.
So it's about developing a strong tendency toward virtue, even if we don't have that perfect philosophical understanding.
Exactly. Remember those guardians in Callipolis? They're really intense education. It's not just about filling their heads with facts. It's about shaping their character, teaching them to love what's good and honorable.
So they learn to actually embody justice, even if they can't fully explain the philosophical ideas behind it.
Right, exactly. And this idea of moral education, it's really important for understanding how Plato sees the connection between, a person being virtuous and a society being just. He believes that a well-ordered city is one that, encourages virtue in its citizens from when they're young.
Which is why those philosopher rulers, the ones who do understand the forms, they have such a crucial role, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, they're the ones who design the education system, they shape the culture, they make sure that the citizens are, guided towards the good.
This idea of philosopher kings, it's always been one of the most controversial parts of Plato's political philosophy. It sounds super elitist, doesn't it? Like, who decides who's wise enough to rule, and what about, individual freedom?
Yeah, it's definitely a point of disagreement. And Plato, he knew about these criticisms. He knew that the idea of philosophers ruling might seem, kind of ridiculous. Actually, he even has Socrates say that philosophers are often reluctant to rule. They'd rather be off thinking about those eternal forms than dealing with, the messy world of politics.
That's interesting. If they understand the good and know how to create a just society, why wouldn't they want to be in charge?
Because for Plato, true wisdom isn't about, power or control. It's about this deep understanding of how reality works, the search for truth for its own sake. And he suggests that the philosophers, precisely because they have this wisdom, they understand how heavy the responsibility of leadership is, the potential for corruption, the difficulty of balancing all these different interests.
No, they're not like power-hungry tyrants. They're actually the ones who are the most hesitant to rule.
Right. And Socrates argues that this is exactly why they're the best people for the job. They're driven by a sense of duty and obligation to use their knowledge to help the city, not by their own ambition or a desire for control.
Okay, I can see how that might work in this perfect world of Callipolis. But back here in the real world, where, ambition and self-interest are everywhere, this whole idea of philosopher king seems a little far-fetched, don't you think?
Yeah, it's definitely hard to imagine it actually working, and Plato himself admits that the ideal city might never actually exist. He presents it more as a thought experiment, a way to explore the principles of justice and to critique the political systems we already have.
Right. And speaking of critique, let's talk about those defective constitutions that Socrates describes. He doesn't exactly paint a pretty picture of what happens when societies stray from the path of justice, does he?
No, he doesn't. And it's really interesting how he connects these different regimes back to the tripartite soul. He says that each defective constitution is like a reflection of a different kind of imbalance within the soul.
So it's like the city itself becomes this big picture of the individual soul.
Exactly. He starts with timocracy, which is a regime ruled by honor and military strength. It's a step down from Callipolis, where reason is in charge. In a timocracy, the spirited part of the soul is dominant, leading to a society that values courage and glory above all else.
Which, sounds good at first, but you can see how that could easily lead to aggression and the desire for conquest.
Absolutely. And from there, things get even worse and become an oligarchy where the love of wealth takes over. Now the appetitive part of the soul is in control, which leads to a society obsessed with possessions and driven by greed.
And that creates all sorts of problems, right? Like inequality, poverty, crime, as those who don't have enough try to get ahead.
Exactly. And this leads almost inevitably to democracy, which Socrates describes as this kind of chaotic marketplace of values where everyone is free to pursue their own desires, whether those desires are, good or bad, wise or foolish.
It doesn't sound like he's a big fan of democracy.
Yeah, he's definitely got mixed feelings about it. He recognizes the value of individual freedom and, having different opinions, which democracy allows. But he's also worried about the potential for mob rule, the tyranny of the majority, the lowering of standards, and the pursuit of fleeting pleasures at the expense of what's good for everyone.
And it's interesting how some of these criticisms of democracy, they still resonate today. We're still trying to figure out how to balance individual freedoms with the need for order and a cohesive society.
Absolutely. And Plato's analysis, even though it was written so long ago, it gives us a way to think about these challenges that never really go away. And finally, he describes the most dysfunctional regime of all, tyranny.
The rule of the tyrant, right? Consumed by their own desires, not limited by law or morality. It's a pretty scary picture of unchecked power.
And it represents the complete breakdown of the tripartite soul. Reason has been totally crushed. Spirit is twisted and corrupted to serve the tyrant's whims, and appetite rules everything, leading to a life of never-ending craving, paranoia, and ultimately misery.
It's a really strong warning about the dangers of letting our baser instincts control our lives and, our societies.
And it takes us right back to that central question of the Republic. Is it always better to be just than unjust?
Right. So Socrates has built this whole elaborate framework, this exploration of individual psychology and political systems, all to answer that seemingly simple question. And it's clear that for him, the answer is a big yes. But he doesn't just say this, right? He gives us arguments, those famous proofs for the superiority of the just life. And I think that's where we need to pick up in the next part of our deep dive. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been on this incredible journey through Plato's Republic, exploring all these ideas about justice and the soul, the ideal city, all that.
Yeah, we've definitely covered a lot from that fascinating city soul analogy to the whole idea of the tripartite soul and those kind of disturbing defective constitutions.
And through it all, Plato keeps coming back to this one central question. Is it always better to be just than unjust? He's not satisfied with just saying it's a moral principle. He wants to show us, philosophically, why the just life is truly the best life.
Right, and that's where those three proofs come in. They're not really proofs in like the strict mathematical sense. They're more like philosophical arguments, carefully put together to convince us that justice is like inherently good, even if you don't get any external rewards or punishments.
Okay, I'm ready to be convinced. Let's hear these proofs. What's the first one all about?
So the first proof, it builds on that analogy we've been talking about, the one between the city and the soul. Socrates says that just like a healthy city is one where all the parts are working together smoothly, a healthy soul is one where reason, spirit, and appetite are all in balance.
So justice is like a state of inner well-being, a kind of like psychological health.
Exactly. And the opposite, injustice, is like a disease of the soul. Socrates gets really, really graphic, describing different types of unjust souls, and each one is more messed up and miserable than the last. He paints this particularly vivid picture of the tyrant who's ruled by his insatiable appetites, always wanting more and never satisfied.
It's like he's saying that the unjust person is a slave to their own desires, always searching for something they can never really get.
Yeah, that's a great point. And this is a big part of the first proof. Justice, because of its inner harmony and balance, it allows the person to go after what's truly good for them. The just person isn't always fighting with conflicting desires or giving in to temptations. Their reason is in control, guiding them toward a fulfilling and happy life.
So the just person is, in a way, more free from being controlled by their own desires.
Yeah, that's a powerful way to put it. And it gets at the heart of why Plato sees justice as so valuable. It's not just about following rules or doing what society expects. It's about living in a way that's true to our nature as rational beings.
Okay, that's a convincing argument. But you said there are two more proofs. What's the next one about?
So the second and third proofs focus on the idea of pleasure. Now, this might seem like a strange way to argue for justice. I mean, we usually associate pleasure with indulging ourselves, satisfying our desires, even our baser instincts.
Right. Like the classic idea of a hedonist, the person who chases pleasure above everything else.
Exactly. But Socrates challenges that view. He says there are true pleasures and false pleasures, and he argues that a lot of the pleasures we go after are just the satisfaction of a lack, a temporary relief from pain or discomfort.
So it's like quenching your thirst, but the thirst always comes back.
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy. Think about the pleasure you get from eating when you're starving. It's intense, but it doesn't last. As soon as you're full, the pleasure is gone. These are what Socrates calls false pleasures. They're based on a deficiency, a lack of something we need.
And he contrasts these with true pleasures. What are those like?
True pleasures, for Socrates, they're not about filling a void. They come from the activity itself. He uses the example of learning, the pleasure of gaining knowledge, of understanding the world. It's not about satisfying a physical need. It comes from the act of thinking, of using our reason.
So it's a more lasting, more fulfilling kind of pleasure.
Exactly. And Socrates argues that the pleasures that come with living a just life, the pleasures of virtue, of wisdom, of a well-ordered soul, these are true pleasures. They don't depend on outside circumstances or the satisfaction of fleeting desires. They come from the very act of living according to reason and virtue.
I see. So he's making a case for the inherent satisfaction of the just life, even if it doesn't always come with, material rewards or social recognition.
Precisely. And the third proof kind of builds on this idea. Socrates says that only the philosopher, the person who has grasped the form of the good and understands the true nature of pleasure, only they can judge which life is really more pleasurable, the just life or the unjust life.
So the philosopher is like the the ultimate judge of happiness.
In a way, yes.
Mm.
Because they have this knowledge of the good, they have a deeper understanding of what truly makes for a good and fulfilling life. And they can see that people who are chasing those fleeting pleasures, who let their appetites control their lives, they're missing out on a much deeper and more lasting kind of happiness.
These pleasure proofs are really interesting. They get at something really profound about what motivates us and what happiness really is. But I got to admit, I'm still struggling with this whole idea of the forms. It seems so abstract, so far removed from our everyday experience. How do we even know these forms exist?
Yeah, that's a question that's bothered philosophers for centuries. And even in Plato's own dialogues, there are different ways of understanding the forms and how they relate to the physical world. Some scholars say that the forms are more like metaphors, ways of representing ideal concepts. Others take a more literal view, and they believe that they exist in a separate realm that we can access through reason.
So there's no like definitive answer.
Not really. And that's part of what makes Plato's philosophy so great. It invites us to wrestle with these big questions, to really think philosophically, to come to our own conclusions.
Okay, that's fair. I guess I'm starting to think like a Platonist. But let's bring this back to the main question of our deep dive. After all this talk about justice, the soul, the ideal city, the messed up constitutions, the proofs, what does it all mean for us, as we try to figure out life in the 21st century?
That's the big question, isn't it? And I
Yeah.
don't think Plato gives us a simple set of rules or a clear roadmap. But I do think there are some really profound insights that we can take away from the Republic, even if we don't agree with everything he says.
Like what do you see as the most important lessons from this work that have stood the test of time?
Well, for me, it's the emphasis on self-knowledge. The Republic is like a call to really look at our own beliefs and desires, to understand what shapes our motivations and our choices. And it reminds us that true happiness isn't about external rewards or chasing after fleeting pleasures. It's about living in a way that's true to our nature as rational beings, about developing those virtues that lead to inner harmony and a sense of purpose.
It's about trying to become the best version of ourselves, even if we never achieve perfect justice or grasp those elusive forms.
Exactly. And I think Plato would agree that the journey itself, the pursuit of wisdom and virtue, it's just as important as the destination.
It's been amazing exploring the depths of the Republic with you, and I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
Oh, for sure. This is a book you can keep coming back to, and you'll always find new insights, new questions, new challenges.
And maybe that's the biggest lesson of all the search for wisdom, questioning what we think we know, the search for meaning. It's a lifelong journey. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Plato's Republic. We hope you've enjoyed exploring it with us.